Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you joining us. We're going to just give one more moment for folks to jump in through the waiting room. I'm Beth Rabbitt. I have the blessing of getting to run the Learning Accelerator, who's hosting this webinar today. And my colleagues, Megan and Lacey, are throwing just some accessibility info and information in the chat. They will also be moderating our Q&A, the submissions as we go. So just really excited to have you, and we'll start in just a second. And if you are here, it would be great to see you drop your name and location in the chat just to introduce yourself and help us know who's here, as well as to help other potential participants. Oh, never mind. I'm informed you all cannot do that. So there goes that. See, I'm just starting to set expectations right off the bat for everyone. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday. I'm Beth Rabbitt. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Learning Accelerator, and we're so excited you could join us for this conversation today about developing a strategic, outcomes-based approach to AI in your schools and districts and organizations. I am thrilled to be hosting this conversation because I think a lot of our conversations about AI can focus on very specific tools, or they can focus on the larger possibilities without kind of getting to the nitty-gritty about what it means to be leading a school system and teaching and learning through the arrival of AI to ensure that we're still driving towards excellence and equity, while also being future focused with our kids. I am super delighted to have John Rice of Hamilton County Schools with me, as well as Rudy Elizondo from the Alliance, to just dive deep with us and let us into their thinking as two leaders who have been working through this process. Just to very quickly offer a little bit of background on our organization and why we think this conversation is so important. So the Learning Accelerator envisions a world in which each student receives the effective, engaging, and equitable education they need to reach their full and unique potential. We are blessed to work across the education sector with hundreds of or other organizations and thousands of districts who are in this work with us. And our work is about building an education field where you all can work and learn faster together to change systems, to produce radically better outcomes for kids. We do that in three ways. The first is we're trying to set and advance an agenda for change. The second is that as an organization, we bring people together to accelerate learning and progress on key priorities, such as AI. And we also work to build field-wide capacity for learning and sharing, both through events like this, as well as through partnerships with organizations at a variety of different levels across the K-12 space to help them understand what's working, what's not, how they might innovate. To speak briefly to the statement I made about what we think a vision of excellence is for learners. At CLA, we think this is about learning that is personalized to the uniqueness of every kid, not just their academic needs, but also their strengths, their interests, their context, their community, and their identity. Learning that's focused on outcomes, so mastery and competency, rather than just the process or inputs of school. And finally, learning that's whole child, that really recognizes we're developing whole human beings, even as we're aiming towards specific outcomes, particularly in academia. So with regards to this vision, the question we've been asking is like, what is the role of AI as utility that's powering a ton of new tools, and just ed tech more broadly to help us achieve this for kids? We've been working on two big projects right now, one of which is our exponential learning project initiative, which is where we're working with 10 networks of technology-supported innovations that are deploying in districts across America to really understand how they work in classrooms as they scale. Our colleagues John and Rudy actually are connected to one of those networks and have been doing work directly on the ground. And then secondly, we're also running a collaborative with leading educators, which is about bringing together school teams around questions of how to solve issues of equity with coherence in school environments. And a big takeaway here across this work, at least for me, is that artificial intelligence is a newly arrived technology. It offers wholly new ways of working and thinking, and it's also just technology. So as we've been kind of helping people understand where and how to deploy, we generally talk about a three-part cycle, which is true for any tool in the classroom. Which first, like selection, which is how do we set the right priorities and find the right tools to test those, solving those priorities given goals. Second, how do we set a strong plan for the trial? For whom are we setting the plan for and with what supports? And then evaluation. At the end of that, how do we know if we're getting the results we want? And what should we do next? The tricky part of this is that while that cycle seems straightforward, we have to do all of this by grounding in equity, our goals for kids, an aligned vision for teaching and learning across our systems, and effectively engaging all the stakeholders that have to be part of that process, ranging from the learner all the way up to teachers and other stakeholders in our communities. And the hard part is pulling that all together. And I'm really excited that, by the way, you can access a guide that we've designed for teams that's totally open source that goes through this process that we developed with the Massachusetts Department of Education. But I'm really excited because I have two leaders who are actually doing this. And so I'm really excited to introduce John and Rudy, who are actually going to start off by just laying out the context for deployment of AI in their systems and their visions for learning. So we're sort of starting in the center of that circle. I'm going to turn it over to John. John?
Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome. And I'm coming to you live from Chattanooga, Tennessee, from Hamilton County Schools. Hamilton County Schools serves the Chattanooga, Tennessee metro area. For those that don't know, Chattanooga is the fourth largest district in Tennessee after Nashville, Knoxville, and Memphis. And we serve around 45,000 students across 80 schools. We're also large geographically speaking. We have 560 square miles of territory. And so we've got schools in our urban downtown core, suburban schools, and then rural schools 40 so miles away from downtown. So we have a pretty broad and diverse district across lots of different measures. And we feel that that diversity is a real strength of ours, that we can serve all students and all students are welcome and can thrive in our schools. And we're really proud of the work we're doing to connect all of our kids. The way Hamilton County thinks about teaching and learning is on our next slides. And we think that there's two things kids need to be really successful in school. One is around academics, and one is about building relationships. And I'll talk about those two separately. First, on our academic front, we think all of our classrooms, in front of all of our kids, we need three things. We need awesome, rigorous content. And for kids, that means high quality instructional materials in front of them every day, and that's aligned to grade level standards. We think that's an equity strategy, and research suggests when we put great high quality, grade level appropriate materials in front of kids, they rise to the occasion and they meet those high expectations. And so we think it's important that every day kids come to school, they're engaging with rigorous content. Secondly, we believe in having worthwhile tasks for students to do. So every day when we're in class, we're asking them to tackle challenging things that allow them to show their learning in a meaningful way. And so that every day they're engaging with something high quality and worthwhile. And then third, we really value and promote purposeful student engagement. What we mean by that is kids spending the majority of the time doing the work of the lesson, taking the cognitive lift, having great academic discourse with each other, and being the ones driving the learning, as opposed to the teacher kind of sage on the stage delivering the learning. And so we've got a big focus on this academic press, but we also believe deeply in building connections and relationships with kids, which we kind of call personalization. And so what we want here is that kids will experience deeper connections and relationships with their peers at school, with their teachers and educators, and with the broader school community. We do this through things like clubs, through advisories, through staff circles and student circles, through lots of different ways, but all through those goals, we're trying to build deep belonging and connection for kids. And we think that we can't just have the academics, we've also got to have this important personalization and belongingness so kids feel a connection to their school. And we think if we do those things well, we'll have students that do all the things that Beth described, reaching their full and unique potential. How AI fits into that for Hamilton County aligns to both academic press and personalization. We think there's some great AI tools that can push the way we're thinking about rigorous content, worthwhile tasks, and purposeful student engagement. We can do those things better and more deeply with some AI. And I think there's some opportunity where if we're able to automate some things or restructure how our staff's time is, they can spend that time building deeper relationships and connections with kids and have a greater sense of belonging. And so as we go on in this conversation, I'll share a little bit more about the specifics, but broadly speaking, we're trying to encourage both academics and student belonging using AI. And I know that's probably counterintuitive of technology building deeper connections, but I think there's ways that we're thinking about that differently. So
Thanks, John.
that's Hamilton County.
Excited to hear about those ways. Rudy?
Yeah, thank you, John, and welcome everybody. So I'm Rudy Elizondo. I'm the Chief Instructional Officer for Alliance College Ready Public Schools, where I'm coming to you also live from Los Angeles. We're actually the largest charter management organization in the greater LA metropolitan area. Give a little bit of context around what our organization is striving to do. We serve historically underserved communities, and so if you go to the next slide, our network aims to be a network of high performing schools. We're comprised of 26 middle and high schools. The majority of our scholars are either first generation going to college and or still within the poverty, below the poverty line in Los Angeles. And so our goal is really to ensure that we have 75% or more of our graduates attending a four-year college or university. A little bit of context around the 26 school, if you go to the next slide. So we serve about 12,500 scholars. The majority of our scholars do come three or more grade levels behind in both math and reading, which gives you a little bit of context around what we're trying to do around accelerating the possibilities of opportunities for our scholars. 98% of our scholars do identify as Black or African American, and 94% are free or reduced lunch. We also have a pretty substantial scholars with disabilities population at about 13%, and 16% of our scholars are also English learners. I will add, though, however, about 80% are either long-term or former English language learners. And so that literacy barrier is really something that we have to be very intentional about addressing. But given all that, a lot of our instructional model is about acceleration. And so we do have a 95% graduation rate, A through G requirements, and 96% of our scholars are accepted into a four-year college university, of which 85% are first in their families to go to college. And we also do have about a four-time increase in the comparison to the national average around scholars with similar demographics that are graduating from college at Alliance. So really kind of just goes to show that we're very intentional about the instructional programs that we offer in our community. Go to the next slide. So a lot similar to what John shared, a lot of our focus is about creating not just rigorous, but also joyful experiences in schools. And so as a network, we have three priorities, one of which AI falls into two of them pretty clearly, is around creating an environment where we have a positive culture of learning in every single classroom. A lot of the holistic considerations around taking care of the whole child, while also making sure that we are empowering our communities, given that they are very diverse populations. And so we're not doing onto them, but actually thinking through how we empower them to be leaders and advocates for their communities and for their schools as well. Essential content in every single classroom really speaks to both our commitment to investing in high quality instructional materials, but also actually creating the ecosystem where we can continually iterate on the planning and the facilitation of those high quality materials. And so how are we actually taking in the experiences of kids, what is motivating to them, while also thinking through what is going to best prepare them for college and making sure that we're being really intentional about how our staff and our teachers are planning for and executing that content is critical to our model. And then the last is really around making sure that data practices is lively, right? We want to make sure that our staff and our kids, as well as our families, are being really intentional about what data they're collecting, what the data is telling them, both qualitatively and quantitatively, and then how we're using that data, not just at critical like key performance cycles, but on a daily basis to actually help shift the what is happening in the classroom experience on a daily basis. Now, how AI falls into this, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we go through what was the criteria, is to really think about not just rebuilding post-pandemic, but actually accelerating post-pandemic. And so AI is really about, for us, leveraging the tool to cover the inequitable impact that the pandemic had on our communities. And so really thinking through how we leverage technology to accelerate that learning. We also really want to think through individualizing learning, right? If we're really trying to create cultures of learning in our classrooms, we also have to recognize that each of our kids needs slightly something different, especially given the diverse population of where our students are in terms of their learning, their language acquisition skills, and any of their individualized needs. That individualization is critical and something that AI can help us do at scale and much more efficiently than not having an AI tool in the past. And then also really using AI to rethink possibilities. We've invested a lot and had a lot of positive impact in the current infrastructure around teaching and learning that we've created. And there is something to be said around the old way of teaching and what is possible in the new generation of teaching. And so really thinking through how we not just integrate AI into our teaching practices, but how do we rethink teaching practices altogether? And so I'm very excited to share a lot of our learning through this last year.
Thank you both for that intro to your context and to your goals for learners. We're going to move into selection next. And just to offer some color from TLA's point of view, there are thousands of products that are very quickly entering the marketplace, some of which are based on a lot of sound design and some of which are not. And there are lots and lots of problems we could try to solve with the introduction of new tools. But there are also trade-offs with adding new tools into a system. You know, every tool you bring in requires training, and time is perhaps our teacher's time and attention is our teacher's most valuable resource. There are also like higher value places to put it, depending on where your challenges of equity actually live. And so I'd love, Rudy, if you want to start first, I'm going to stop the share so folks can see you better. But can you get into like, how did you decide which tools to try and why?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a little context here. So beyond just the context of our school system, when the data was very loud for us, right? It was very urgent. Since the pandemic, we knew we were just refocusing on rebuilding some basic foundational practices. We had a core of teachers that honestly had never done live teaching when we hired them. We were in distance learning for about a little bit over a year. And so we had all these basic things around how do I do lesson planning? How do I do classroom management? How do I access curriculum? What do I do when a scholar is off track or misunderstanding? Doing that in a virtual setting is very different than doing that in an in-person setting. In addition to that, the increase in the gap around scholar proficiency in math and ELA just exponentially increased. And once we engaged in a root cause analysis, what we realized was that our old model of leveraging things like intervention and remediation was no longer going to work, because who needed intervention and remediation was actually closer now to 70% of our population rather than the traditional, 10 to 15% of our population. And that obviously required us to really rethink, where are we doubling down in resources? Yes, we engaged in things like in-person high dosage tutoring, but those are still remediation issues. And so we really wanted to look at the core of our instructional model. And in addition to that, not just tack on a tool that we think was going to help, but how are we actually asking teachers to plan differently? How are we asking students to engage differently with the content that was being discussed in the classroom? And so with that, that kind of helped us shift our focus to be away from remediation into acceleration, and to really think about a new approach around how we both leverage the things that we said we need to happen, which is strengthening our foundational practices. And to be really clear, that was intellectual preparation, lesson planning, how you prepare and engage scholars in discourse, and then how we regularly assess student mastery, and then engage in reteaching. So that's what I mean when I say foundational practices. And so where AI became an integral part of that strategy was we looked for AI tools that would actually fit into our existing professional development and investment on foundational practices. How are we using intellectual preparation with AI? And so this actually gave us a little bit of filter as to which AI tools were worth pursuing, right? The standalone ones that don't actually talk to our curriculum, that don't have two-way communication between our students and our teachers, were kind of immediately off the table, and starting to explore which ones actually are leveraging our high-quality instructional materials, which ones do create meaningful two-way communication with our kids, were the ones where we were going to start to explore. We also really wanted to think about individual learning is important, but I don't want AI tool to actually overtake the value that a teacher has in the nuance of where students have mastery or lack of mastery. And so the way we were thinking about that with AI tools is we almost like tiered intervention. AI is going to work for individual learning for 80% of our kids. There are still 20% of our kids that are going to need intensive in-person one-on-one support. And so what are the AI tools best suited to actually allow a teacher to focus on the kids that are heading towards that 20% need of services, and be able to cover individualized learning for the majority of the scholars? So think of it as like a tier 1 intervention, not a tier 3 intervention. And then also making sure that we are setting ourselves up to actually create champions of this work. We didn't want an AI tool that was so fully baked that our that there's already a narrative around there, around like its quality, its usability, its ease of integration. And so looking for AI tools that actually allowed our teachers very directly to provide feedback, iterate on, and really start to position them to be the change agents of how we leverage AI in our entire system of 1,600 teachers.
So interesting. And I think just to repeat back a little what I just heard, looking for tools that actually empower your vision for teaching and learning rather than being additive or potentially distracting away, particularly within the context of having teachers who are learning how to do this well for really heterogeneous classrooms. um, there are a lot of folks who've said, well, the AI tutor, can be for those kids who need to ask questions or get to extra sort, but you're really flipping that to say, actually, we're going to prioritize our teacher time for those kids for whom this is not going to work. I think, education might be actually the only field where we demand every technology tool be terrific for 100% of kids. So how are we, freeing up that time? And then, really empowering your teachers to see it as a tool by getting ahead of it. I mean, okay, how are we going to learn to do this together rather than waiting too long and then feeling like it's got to be retrofitted, or maybe just going out, blazing at like any potential teacher could try anything for any problem. So pretty centralized and coherent approach.
Absolutely. This concept of democratizing the potential of teachers and scholars is how we've kind of have positioned ourselves around which AI tools are worth scaling over the next couple of years.
We're all writing that note of democratizing the potentials of teachers and scholars. Got that, friends? Well, thank you, Rudy. John, love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Hamilton County, I think when ChatGPT emerged, I think we're talking late 2022, it wasn't much longer till in our system, suddenly there were AI uses popping up all across our 80 schools. And the question was, whoa, what are we really doing with AI? Are we just kind of letting the Wild West happen with teachers figuring things out? Or should we centralize our approach and be a little clear about what we want? And so our district put together an AI committee with members of our teaching and learning team, with members of our tech team, and we tried to identify some key priorities that align to what I mentioned before around academic press and personalization. And so we had two charges. Charge one, how can we improve outcomes, particularly with kids who have had these gaps post COVID, as Rudy mentioned? And how can we take things off teachers' plates? I mean, if you ask our teachers, number one thing they say is give us more time, stop giving us more stuff, take stuff off our plate. And so where could we do that? Is AI going to enable us to do that so that they could spend their time doing more meaningful things, like I mentioned before, building relationships? So those key charges improve outcomes, particularly for our neediest students, and save teachers time, take things off the plate, were what has driven kind of our selection process. And so as we went out to look at the field, as you mentioned, there was a million tools that hit our inboxes. There was a million tools that were announced in webinars, all kinds of things. Um, but we thought, what are things that are aligned to high quality instructional materials? What are things that are pushing where we already know we have gaps? And what are things that are going to help accelerate learning? For us, that was the transition grades of sixth grade and ninth grade. We find that when students go from fifth to sixth, there's a drop off in learning. Same for eighth to ninth. So let's target something there. Secondly, we thought maybe there's something around the paperwork around IEPs and special education. Our teachers that are serving students with IEPs tell us there's a lot of paperwork. Maybe there's something there that can save time, be more efficient. And then potentially there's things around large language models, like giving feedback on writing or things that tend to take a lot of teachers' times that we might target. And so our AI committee decided to pick 5 or 6 really specific pilots and to go, and we tried for the last, I'd say 14 months, tried to nail some small pilots that we could see. Do we need to ditch? Do we need to expand? Do we need to iterate on these different pilots? And that's been our approach, to try a couple things small scale this school year in advance of what might be a larger game next year.
Thanks, John. I think what I'm appreciating, what I just heard, is real focus on looking at data and talking to people about where are those kind of choke points where we feel like we need to solve problems, we don't know how to solve them with the existing tools. And then going back a little bit to that first graphic I showed around, we can do all this selection, implementation, evaluation we want, but unless we're actually tied to vision, Rudy, you spoke to this a lot too, focused on challenges of equity, not like just general stuff, and really actually engaging our stakeholders, who obviously for both of your systems really include teachers along with students and families. was a way that you were able to sort of cut through the noise and start figuring out where to begin. John, you kind of started leading us in this direction, so I'd love to have you kind of lean into implementation. You were talking about pilots. So where did you just give it to every school? Where did you start?
Yeah, I think what's important when you're piloting any tool in schools or ed tech type thing, you want to find, especially in the first year, coalitions of the willing. And so we found we had one tool that I was leading around middle school, aligned to our ELA classrooms that was going to help us with close reads, first reads, and writing. We thought that tool, called Course Mojo, was going to be really impactful because it aligned to our curriculum, and it was going to help our teachers do the teaching and learning around English language arts so much better. But it wasn't for everyone. And so we asked our principals and schools, hey, who's interested? But I also targeted the schools that had the greatest need in terms of academic performance and said, hey, extra nudge, would you be interested in this as well? And so we identified a couple willing and schools in need to take on that early pilot. And each of our AI committee members took a similar approach, looking at data, looking at stakeholder willingness, looking at other kind of factors to figure out where we might push in on particular pilots. So we have a partnership with the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga here that they're developing an AI pilot. And so we have a high school teacher who has a close connection with the university who's going to be piloting something too. So it kind of depended case by case on what the need was, but definitely finding people who felt willing and able to take on something new and daunting, in addition to all the responsibilities, was key for us. Um, in terms of, I think there's anything like what actually happened as part of your question, Beth, so I can jump into that.
Or we can go,
Also,
we can talk about an evaluation too. So like, but maybe, were there surprises in like aside from what happened in terms of learning or outcomes, were there surprises in implementation?
the one big surprise is we felt really positive that there was room to improve the special education paperwork kind of process for teachers. Again, this is something that they report regularly. This takes a lot of time. There's seems to be a lot of redundancy. Is this something we can work on? And the answer actually turned out to be no. We haven't been able to find an AI tool that we felt kept our students' data private, that also provided the useful kind of efficiencies around writing IEPs and things like that. And so that's something that we're just kind of stuck on to, like, we've identified the problem, we know what the need is, we know there's tools out there, but those tools and our stipulations around data privacy just haven't aligned in such a way to help us solve that problem. So I thought we would have an answer 6 months into this, but we haven't. So I think still room to grow in this field, to your point that this is still a pretty early stage thing.
Yeah, sometimes the lowest hanging fruit is in fact not. We certainly are seeing that in other fields like medicine, where we're finding out actually the tools don't work as well as the person, or in fact, that task is not actually what LLMs, and we should be careful as we're talking about artificial intelligence. We've had artificial intelligence in education for a long time, predictive artificial intelligence, recommendation based. LLMs, which are generative, are new, and they are actually more akin to having a human who could make mistakes but help you be generative as opposed to like, the perfect tool. So thanks for sharing that. Rudy.
Yeah, I think pretty similarly. Let's start. We actually clustered the kinds of AI tools we were going to research and explore piloting. We broke it up into 3 clusters. It was the first cluster around clerical lifts, which are the AI tools that are going to provide administrative clerical lifts for teachers, our staff, and administrators. And then we had another cluster that was about scholar support, like which are the AI tools that are going to provide individualized support for scholars. And there's a third one kind of in between, and obviously there can be a bridge across this one and the last one, which is teacher support around grading, analyzing data, and potentially lesson planning, things like that. What we found was the clerical support tools are pretty plentiful, and I would say on the stronger end in terms of being able to adopt and implement. However, given the landscape of a lot of the AI startups, one of the ones that we actually were exploring and about to scale ended up being sold to someone else, and so we had to abandon that. And so what I actually taught us is we also have to think about the longevity of the AI tools we're investing in as we decide which ones we're going to pilot on, right? Because a lot of these startup companies are actually trying to create a niche to actually sell and walk away with money rather than thinking about the larger potential impact around efficiency.
Wait. You're saying there are different incentives
There
that
are.
profit ed tech providers, who are essential, right, to this work, have than school leaders and districts. It's so important to call that out. I worked at a school back in the aughts where we were trying to do blended learning and we had an LMS provider who was like, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then they're like, oh, market pivot. And we ended up, duct taping Google Classroom before there was to do Google Classroom. But it's something that I just want to make sure everyone heard. This is a market that does not operate on an annual selection cycle basis. And you might have a tool that runs out of money. So I think it's a really great and important point. And then John, I think you said earlier, there are also incentives and requirements on data and safety that folks might not be up to yet.
Right. And it actually helped refine the way we were going to pilot the second time around once we started to look at student and teacher support AI tools. And it actually added a piece where we said, we know AI is not going to be a silver bullet. So that was fundamental. We also named very clearly in communication to when we started to pitch this pilot to schools was that we still believe as a system, the most critical factors to student learning are teachers using rigorous curriculum, teachers doing intellectual prep and lesson planning, and teachers using data to inform their instruction. And AI is a tool to actually support that. So it changed a little bit of our messaging. And the last piece I'll add here is that the tools that we considered, we got an opportunity to speak to some of the researchers and developers of AI tools and ask point blank, are these tools designed first to consider the needs of diverse learners, so students with disabilities and multilingual learners, or are they designed for something else in mind? That actually helped change the tenor of how then we engage not just with our teachers, but also with the developers of the AI tools. Because fundamentally, then that actually gives us a sense of shared moral imperative around why we're trying to drive these AI tools. We were very regimented about how we then rolled out the pilot. So we created a criteria, and I'm happy to share this criteria if anybody wants it, where we actually made sure that our criteria matched those fundamental statements that I just made at the beginning. So just to give you a concrete example, one of them was a teacher must be in 6th grade using expeditionary learning curriculum was one criteria. The curriculum must be used with 100% fidelity and no modifications where you're bringing in your own stuff and doing your own designing, right? The teacher must be willing to develop strong intellectual preparation practices if they don't have them. Administrators are committing to releasing teachers for these regular professional developments and professional learning communities, in addition to also having a two-way communication between my team at the central office who was running the AI pilots and the school site, and that the principal agrees to doing collaborative walkthroughs with us when we bring developers in and the central office team to understand how the AI pilot is rolling out. That actually, when we sent out that criteria, it helped filter, some of the folks that are just interested in AI versus interested in the instructional model that we're trying to create around AI. And honestly, to my earlier point, really helped us cultivate the champions that are going to drive this work forward.
Thank you so much. Well, so this is now going to, sort of the end of the cycle. When we're piloting something that is really innovative, knowing how it worked, for whom did it work, and under what conditions and why can be tough. And you don't want to try something, not implement it well, and then blame the product, or try something, implement it in a way and need to do something different. So how have you thought about knowing whether or not the investments you're making are helping achieve your outcomes? And we'll start with Rudy.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to monitor the data, right? And so part of it was establishing the clear goals that we're hoping to accomplish and thinking of it from 2 tiers. There's the goal of accomplishing implementation of the AI tool. And then there's the goal of what is the AI tool hoping to accomplish around student outcomes. And so we got very clear about what are the goals for that first category and what are the goals for the second category. And so being able to ensure, again, not to beat a dead horse here, but making sure that we have access to data, that our schools have access to data, and that there's a uniform way that we are seeing that data, and then actually creating an ecosystem around it. We built out key performance indicator step backs where we look at the AI generated data in crosswalking it to our school and our network goals, right? And we have a pretty codified process that happens 4 times a year where we look at progress in that work. The other part is actually a little bit more of a communication strategy, communicating out to those that are piloting and communicating out to the larger system. Here's what we are learning from the pilot, and not hiding the ball on some of the pain points, right? The first quarter of the implementation was rocky. Our teachers who were piloting were not happy with the AI tool. I would say, 3 of them weren't happy, but not because they were they thought it immediately we should get rid of it. They had feedback for how we can actually think about doing it better, and this is where the two-way communication really matters, because then we were able to adjust our training and development work, our feedback loops, to better respond to what those pain points were. And by sharing that openly and transparently with both those teachers and then the larger community, it also kind of gave an investment of like, oh, they're listening to us. They're actually using our expertise. They're elevating our voice. And the unintended consequences of this, in all transparency, was actually more fidelity to high quality instructional materials. We run a fully autonomous model. We're a charter, but all of our schools, we're not centralized, right? We're not like a success academy here. But what the unintended consequences there is, by leveraging these tools, sharing what's working, we actually ended up creating more uniformity across our schools and leveraging high quality instructional materials, which I would argue is probably having as much, if not more, of an impact than just the AI tool in itself.
Yeah, it's really enabling a whole different set of mindsets and behaviors. A couple of things you called out is one of the worst forms of evaluation in education when we say it didn't work and we don't know why, or like didn't work variable like fidelity. I think your point around establishing what are our implementation measures, certainly as we've been looking at AI tools, but also the research around ed tech generally, dosage matters. So knowing if a kid in fact was following what the plan was, if for other reasons didn't need to, because they didn't really need that much support, getting those data so you really understand. And then to your point, like engaging in iterative learning is such a valuable part of, making these human systems that are schools like actually work with new tools.
Yeah, and I would add the one piece that I think is fundamental is that those feedback loops are not just central office to teachers, it was central office to teachers and to students. That student feedback loop was, I would say, as important to the teacher one, because their experience matters as much, right? And so, we learned ways to gamify some of the AI experiences to just further increase the student experience. We also use Mojo, and it has a speech feature that when we were observing, a class that was mostly English learners wasn't leveraging. And so it actually informed us to go in and do training with the kids around how to leverage the speech feature, right? But again, that requires a clear sense of what you're trying to accomplish and making sure that we fundamentally understand all of the opportunities that the AI tool has to offer, and that we're building in opportunities to experience that learning, the expertise that we might have with the adults and the kids, right? Because, kids are a lot more tech savvy than a lot of us at this point in our lives. And so making sure that we're also empowering them to teach us how to better use these tools is just as important.
Yeah, to your point around value of joy, right? And engagement, that matters. These tools are both building kids' future skills for a reality that we as adults probably can't even conceive of. There's one quick question from the audience is, in terms of getting data from the AI tools you're working with, were there specific types of data that were most important to you as you were evaluating? And also, if people couldn't give you that data, access to data, was that a criteria that would, take that tool off the table?
Yeah. So I would not partner with any AI tool that would not be able to give us data. So again, when I think about the criteria of which ones we pilot, which ones we don't, that was fundamentally a necessity, especially given our network priorities where data practices is actually needed. And so this kind of speaks to alignment to your strategies, right? I am not picking an AI tool. I am picking an AI tool that can be integrated and adapted into our existing strategies. So that matters. I would say there are two big pieces of data. We collect both mastery data, which is clearly important, and we also actually have access to the literal chats that students have had back and forth with the AI chatbot. Now, just to give a quick anecdote, that actually served more than just an academic purpose. In one of our pilots last year, a student was actually sharing their experience about when they lost their mother with the chat AI box in connection to actually how they saw themselves represented with a character in a novel. And in that process, through that back and forth, one, this was a student that historically hadn't engaged with the curriculum, with the content. So we saw an increased level of engagement. But more importantly, because that chatbot flagged for the teacher, hey, there's something to consider here, it actually then let us redirect the student to getting counseling and social emotional support to process that. I would say that is relevant data that is going to help support that student progression through middle school to high school and college, because, I don't know that they would have said that in a public setting if it was just a teacher trying to do a whole class discussion. So there's power there in the literal qualitative anecdotal comments that they may have with a chatbot, in addition to the more traditional academic data around mastery.
Wow. I mean, obviously raises so many questions we can't tackle right now around what perceptions of privacy do kids, think they have? How are we being so careful of these data? But, that conversation, which might have happened one-on-one, is now available in a new way. It's so interesting. John, can you dig in on eval and also maybe address like your data requirements as part of that?
Yeah, and Rudy, like you nailed it. We agree with so many things that you said. There's got to be this component of fidelity to using the tool appropriately as the vendors kind of laid out. This element of like of teacher use in the classroom that's appropriate, student use, etc. I think there's three things that jump out as me as we're thinking about evaluation. Obviously, we would love to run multi-million-dollar randomized control trials to see how these things work. And in the public school setting, that's just like not the reality, right? And so in addition to the things Rudy laid out, we're asking when we're talking to schools with really, I'm talking about teachers and kids, do you like the thing? Is the thing driving you crazy, or do you enjoy using this given tool? And I think that speaks to the dosage. Our dosage for some of our tools is like twice a week, so it's not too much, not too little, feels consistent. And we've had kids go home and tell their parents about how much they like it. We've had kids brag to the seventh and eighth graders, hey, in sixth grade, we get to use this cool AI thing and you don't. I mean, that's not usually kids bragging about what they get to do in class to their peers. So we love that kids and teachers feel good about using some of the tools we've put out there. A second thing we think about is are we getting better results, particularly for our kids who have disabilities and kids who are multilingual learners? And so we're looking at those measures on our interim assessments, and then we'll be looking at that on our state test. And then third, we want to know, is this furthering some of our academic goals around rigorous content? Because we're using this tool, are we more deeply engaging with text? Are we more deeply and more frequently asking kids to write and cite text evidence? And so all those things for us are key. I remember one year, I formerly worked in DC public schools, and we piloted this really cool new tool with a middle school in its math program. All 9 teachers quit at the end of the year. And so even if you got better results quantitatively, you can't have all the teachers quit at the end of a thing. And so there's this aspect of like enjoying the thing and also getting good results out of the thing that I think layer on to that just gut reaction of if a product's going well or not. And so we've gotten that sense in both the pro and the con, depending on the tool we've used.
Yeah, I'd say having all of your teachers quit the school at the end of the year is a bad outcome.
Bad
Uh,
outcome.
no, I love you pointing out the student engagement factor with the tool and being excited. My own daughter, who's a sixth grader, is getting to use a new math curriculum that is technology enabled this year. And she came home one day and she's like, Mom, like kids get to share their answers with each other before like the teacher, and we work on things and then the teacher can call. I think kids are really like appreciating how some of these tools are changing their ways of getting to engage. And they are seeing it. There are opposite stories that come home from school related to technology as well. I want to be totally clear. But it's exciting. I love the fact that both of you are focusing on students and their experiences, because ultimately they are the learners. There is like nothing externally we can do unless they are doing that internal work. Thank you both so much. Okay, now we're going to move into a little fun game, lightning round for both of you. We have a tool at TLA that's called real-time redesign, which is something we use with our networks. Totally open source process. Lacey will throw in the chat it's for teams trying to figure out like how do we make big change by starting with small change. I like to call it sort of like like an innovation kernel and an improvement marshmallow for teams. And at the end of experiments people run, we have this protocol called ditch, iterate, or scale. Ditch meaning, nah, like we headed down a pathway, we learned it was the wrong pathway. Iterate is, ooh, we tried something and we know there's something we can solve. We think there's potential. Maybe it's not engaging enough. Rudy, you were already talking about this process. And then scale, like, wow, this really helped us. Let's go to more teachers. And thinking our systems, but also potentially more broadly as a sector right now. I like thinking of the notion of like, what should we be ditching? Where should we be iterating? Where might we be scaling? For me to model, a big ditch is, humans, for some reason, we are using these chatbots as single sources of truth, and we're using them like Google. These LLMs actually don't work that way. They are constantly ingesting all of the truths we are putting into them, whether they be truthful or not. There are lots of great tools out there that can help us search for definitions and so forth, but simply asking a tutor to answer a question, probably not the right way to be using these tools. And we're actually investing a lot in tools that are doing that. On the iteration front, these tools, and Rudy, you actually provided a powerful example of this, can be great empathic, like listening agent coaches. Where I was reading a case study actually in the medicine space where doctors are actually using these types of tools to practice having hard conversations with patients. And seeing how a response might happen, or even flipping roles and practicing. We spend so much time scaling. Coaching is one of the hardest things. That's an opportunity. And then on the scale front, and you both have referred to the work of Course Mojo, high quality instructional materials are hard to implement in the best of cases, nearly possible to implement with perfect fidelity in classrooms today, given the breadth of needs that we have. The tools that are really training closely to really high quality curriculum and making it possible for every kid to get access points and to engage with the curriculum such that they can do the deeper conversation and learning with teachers and their peers seems like a really important place for us to be focused right now as a sector. So I'm excited about that. So I'll let either of you go first. What would you ditch? What would you iterate? And what would you scale?
Okay, I will jump in. I love this activity. So when I think of what to ditch, I think, and this probably applies to broader than just AI, but I don't think districts should ever say to teachers, hey, teachers, there's a new thing out there. We're going to buy something broad. You go figure it out. You go find what works. And so, like, I wouldn't be in favor of us buying um, Copilot or Gemini or any of the large tools and saying, hey, teachers, just there's probably lots of use cases. You go find what works, and putting the burden on teachers to like solve these problems. I get where that notion comes from, but I really think it's imperative on districts to align, to be strategic, and to say, here's a really specific use case that we think can help. Give us feedback on it. Let's have a conversation about it. But we think this is aligned to our priorities, and we're going to do a lot of the front end work for you so that you can implement this, but not putting more on teachers' plates and asking them to figure stuff out for us. Um, I think on the iterate front, we think there's a lot of potential around getting feedback on writing for kids. We don't have kids writing enough, and we don't always have enough time to give them great feedback on their writing. Former ELA teacher, that's just a really hard time consuming thing, but I do think there is room in the LLM space to give better feedback to kids on writing. We haven't figured that out. We've got a couple promising practices there, but I think that's something moving into the next school year that we're going to be trying to crack a little more and to grow. And then finally, to the scale question, I think I completely agree with you, Beth, that there are tools. The one I'm most excited about with us that we're using is the Course Mojo because it's fully aligned to our curriculum and it allows the teachers to do what they were already doing better, to get better data and to push kids thinking even more. And so I'm excited about tools that are aligned to HQIM. Just thinking about what are the practices happening in your district and what's a tool that's going to enhance and further that as opposed to taking you away. As a quick example, we recently got somebody sharing some slides and it was saying, hey, use AI to develop rubrics that's going to help you assess writing. But we already have rubrics. We already have stuff. We don't need AI to like come up with new different rubrics that aren't aligned to kind of our HQIM and our priorities here. And so we just have to be mindful of not taking us further away from our resources, but getting deeper into our resources.
That would be a definite ditch on redundant, misaligned work there. Rudy?
Like I just want to steal John's answers. Those are great. I mean, very aligned here. I'll add some slight variation around the ditch. I really, and this might be unpopular. I do not like, and I have not liked any of the AI tools that focus on creating lesson planning, creating core rubrics, or that are focused actually as intervention models. I would completely ditch those. I think the ones that are trying to tackle the learning gaps at the furthest end from mastery are the ones that I have found to be the most inefficient or ineffective. And part of it has to do with just like the mindset around ownership of, what is the responsibility of the teacher in actually helping student learning. And just, the parallel to not stealing the cognitive lift from students, I also don't think they are helping, they potentially run the risk of taking the cognitive lift around the teacher and building in that contextual understanding that a teacher needs to actually design lessons based on knowing their kids. So I think in terms of iterating, I actually think less around the AI tools. I think there's opportunities to iterate on the quantitative reasoning AI tools, the ones that are more geared towards math. Those I have found to be, less than stellar at this moment. I think the LLMs are a lot further along in terms of where they are in their evolution of being able to provide not just content or skills, but actually start to do some harder processing with kids. So, I'd iterate a little bit on the math, but a bigger picture here, I think there's opportunity to iterate AI tools with existing educational partners around how we integrate AI tools into things like teacher rubrics, into things like coaching and development for teachers, into professional development. And so there's a opportunity there to create partnerships. If I saw an AI tool in partnership with TNTP, for example, that would be a beautiful marriage that I think has so much potential to think about how we make this truly the part of the lifeblood of schools rather than as something that we're trying to figure out how to shoehorn into schools. In terms of scaling, it's similar to John, like AI tools that speak to high quality instructional materials is fundamental. It has been the thing that has accelerated our kids the most, and to your earlier point, has shifted the mindset of our teachers the most. And so, the easier we can make it for teachers to engage with HQIMs and leverage that and make it less onerous, I think the benefit is for our kids. And I think connected to that, it's also thinking through how do we not just create these tools, but also thinking strategically about the change management strategies to scale these tools at schools and at systems is something that's worth investing in for us in the coming year.
I feel the need to jump in and say, like, neither TMTP or Course Mojo have provided any paid support for this programming. It's great. I mean, I think one of the things I'm taking away is your point around how do we build AI tools? How do we have AI? There's AI is a technology versus AI is a utility. Are we talking about delivering electricity or are we talking about the light bulb? And I think what you're saying is hey, this is a new source of energy. So let's figure out how we use it to animate good stuff we're doing. I also, your comment about the cognitive lift that teachers have in getting to deeply know and understand their students, particularly those students who are farthest from our opportunity, who might need the most support, is definitely something that I'm gonna take away. So have a couple questions for you. We're going to Q&A. For folks in the participating, we have contact information for all three of us, as well as if you're interested in just following up, our general information contact. I'll keep this up for just a second so that you all can see our faces once we take this down. But here's a question that either of you could take. What's your biggest piece of advice for a district or a charter network that has not yet started working with AI?
I'm happy to start. I think for us, the single most important thing was have you considered how this is part of your existing strategies, not an additional strategy? And if you have thought about how it's part of your existing strategies, what is the literal experience that you want those members of your teams to have with potential AI tools? And have you thoughtfully thought through creating time for them to play with these AI tools before we consider piloting?
John?
Yeah, I'll share a kind of a misstep I think we made here in Hamilton County. We also bought a pro license to a large kind of general AI tool for all of our teachers and said to them, hey, use AI in a way that makes a lot of sense. Here's 50 use cases. And we didn't provide the specifics that went with it. We started that in December of 2023 and it ended December of this past year. And we just didn't see the usage with that. We saw a handful of people doing amazing things, and we saw 80+% of our staff not doing anything with it. And I think that speaks to what Rudy just mentioned. It wasn't as targeted and specific and aligned to what teachers needed to do. It was just more kind of, hey, it's out there if you want to use it. And so when we see something like that, I just don't think we're leveraging our resources and guiding staff in a way that's being very helpful. And we end up somehow adding more to their plates instead of taking something off. So I would be strategic and pick something that you can really target in on. Start narrow and then grow from there.
Yeah, if I could add just to John's point as well. So we have said no to AI, to some AI tools. And that is sometimes hard for, as a system leader, to tell a school, as a community of schools, to be like, we're actually not ready to invest in this. And so don't let the urgency and the excitement of AI is everywhere, why aren't we doing anything, push you beyond your readiness to actually pilot and integrate it into your existing strategies.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you both pointed to, which is where you're going to say no, or no to new things, or potentially no to old things. Um, and just acknowledging, I mentioned this earlier before, but one of the biggest challenges we see when people add technology to a system is they don't think about like, okay, what are all the different ways this allows us to act now that we don't need to do these other things before, and how to be super explicit about that with everyone. And then also like, what are those lines where as a system leader, you can't actually afford to have the pro license for everyone if only 4 people, for example, are using it. Um, as you think about next year, what are your plans for scaling? We have 3 minutes, so you've got to answer this fast.
Yeah, so we are scaling. So we are implementing an LLM for all of our 6th grade classrooms and all of our 7th grade classrooms in the coming year. We're going to pilot in 8th grade. The reason why we're piloting 8th grade is we have enough champions in 6th and 7th grade to drive this work forward. We haven't built that coalition in the 8th grade yet. And so we have to be we're essentially adapting what we started to scale across all of our grades eventually down the line.
I think we are also out of the 5 or 6 pilots we mentioned, some of them are going to move forward, some of them are going to go bye-bye. And that's just the reality. And that's why we pilot in the first place, right? You don't want to make the big misstep right off the bat. And so I think we've seen some success in the ELA space, and we're going to grow that to more schools. We haven't seen some success, as I mentioned, around special education or around some of the efficiencies we thought were there. I think Rudy helpfully called them like the clerical kind of lift. I think that's right. We still have some room to grow there. So we're going to continue to try to find solutions there. But again, starting small and then growing from there as opposed to eating the elephant at one go.
Thank you both so much for taking time out of days. I know one of you is running a leadership retreat. We caught John the other day in planning in the middle of a learning walk. We do not take for granted getting time from you both during the day. And I just want to also name getting the sort of like vulnerable, real take that you're able to offer. It's so important in our field that we take the stance of being learners, open learners, because there's so much inequity. We gotta like push as much resource in as we can, and being willing to say, like to your point, John, like some things go bye-bye, and we have to like say why and what that looks like. And so deeply grateful you could join us. If anyone has any questions of panelists, we did throw information chat. Thank you for coming, and we're really looking forward to getting any feedback or questions, because we're actually planning a series of these. Maybe we'll have some repeat returns from Rudy and John as we go. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.